Okay.
I think the first one is just say there is consensus. We're moving forward on that. There was already a push, merge, and then next on that list of related items is distinguishing between artifact ID types, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that is just a copy forward. Yeah, so L section file names, last week on the tech call, we had presentations related to both ELF file content and symlink farms. So I'd queued those up under future agenda items. Happy to discuss them today, take some notes, but I think we need to loop back when we have, with Nella and or Ed.
Yes, so I think the issue that I sent in the chat, the 21, that is the one, that is the spec portion that needs to be reviewed. And if you just scroll to the end of that note, the open items are listed. There, all the review comments have been addressed, and the open items are just clarifications on two things. The first one is there was some discussion of whether we should, currently we store only the hash in the section. So should we have should we store something else like a URI in place of just the hash? And the other thing is, do we want the node.gitbom section to be present as a part of the executable as well? That will determine what attribute should be attached to this section, whether you want this. I think the understanding is it should be present in the core files and should be persisted to the core files, and hence it should be a part of the executable as well, and it should not be stripped. But Yonki mentioned that for embedded situations, we may not need, we may not wish to persist that information. So in that case, they may want to, I don't know if the option for them is to go via go with the option of not embedding the GitBOM information in the section and go with the route of what Yonki proposed without the embedding mode. So if that is the option for embedded developers who do not want any increase in the size of the executable, that is the route that they can choose. While we can say that if the .node.gitbom section is generated, it's always created with this alloc attribute, which means that it will not be stripped and it will be a part of the executable and available at runtime as well. So in future, if there is something that is usually the purpose of a node section, where this information is being taken and utilized at runtime as well. So if in future there is some need for GitBOM to work on runtime for whatever reason that's not conceived now, then it still opens up that possibility. So this was one other comment that Yonki brought up with regards to the attribute for the node section, whether we should mention it in the spec or just leave it implementation defined. It's like whether you want to have that attribute alloc that will persist the node section all the way through the end, to the executable and runtime. So these are the two open issues. I think with that resolved, the spec can be closed and the implementation can be fine-tuned.
So I think it's important that we support the fact that folks will want to do this in a variety of ways. And I understand the need for not including it for the reproducible build. My gut says that is more of a minority case than the majority. And so that should be a configurable option for that type of user, but the default should be to embed it.
Okay, so should the spec cover both cases? Should it mention or should it just mention that when you create a this GitBOM section in the object file and in the executable, you make this with alloc attribute, and then whether you choose to not create it or not is dictated by another option, which is a different part of the spec. Okay.
So your question is really more of, do we make these implementation details or part of the spec?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think this is the kind of advice that should be in a spec, because a spec isn't advice to implementers. A spec is a format or a protocol, and conditions where, right, it's.
Okay.
Yeah, how the metadata is stored on disk, right? What the file format is, how it is propagated, that is appropriate for the spec.
Okay, that is already covered. The only clarity I needed was whether we need to go into the level of what attributes this section should have.
Yes, what attributes should be in the section, what the section name is. If we're talking about the ELF section header, that should be in the spec as well. Perhaps, you know, as an appendix or as within like in the spec subsection ELF, here's a guidance for ELF. Subsection Rust, here's a guidance for Rust crate. Subsection Docker, here's a guidance for a Docker file format. In terms of just laying out the spec, that's how I would arrange it. The overall guidance at the top, and then any specific guidance for different languages or file formats if we need to. But whether or not to embed, I think that is almost more of an existential question for us as a group to go back to, ideally with everybody present or on the mailing list or on Slack, because it really isn't.
So what if I mean, it sounds to me like that it doesn't need to be an existential question. We can enable both options, right? What if we simply say in the spec, the way that this is handled is, and we're embedding, and then there's just a one line item that says, compatible implementations may exclude embedding or something like that. You know, it's just one line that says it doesn't always have to persist.
No, so what I'm saying here is, if you create a .node.gitbom section, I think that it should always be persisted, because that is the purpose of node section. Now, if you don't want to create a node section at the time of building, but if you want to use it out of as an external way using the scripts, which is what the BOM message tool and Yonq is trying to do. If they want to choose that option where you do not create a section in the binary, but you generate the contents for that section in an external outside of the executable, then I think then in that case, it doesn't matter how this, there's no reason to create a node section, and hence this topic would not come. So my argument is, if we say the confusion comes from, there are some examples which indicate that a node section is not necessarily of type alloc, while in general, if you look at the ELF spec about the node section, it says that the reason for the existence of node sections is so that this information can be used at runtime, and hence they have to be persisted.
Yes.
So
if a binary executable with ELF or some other form of binary, I think this is a worthy postulate. If a binary does not contain embedded GitBOM information, then it can be assumed by any tool that is scanning it or running it that there is not GitBOM
Persisted,
information.
Yeah,
right?
persisted BOM information.
If it is not embedded, it can be assumed to not exist. Otherwise, you're left just kind of guessing, where would I find it? How do I trust it? What other mechanisms would have to be invoked to verify this separate file that is somehow, some other way provided relates to this binary? And if it's not embedded, it's not there. From the purpose of scanning. Now, for build systems and propagating, all the other build metadata, that's fine. But for a shipped binary, if it isn't, if the GitBOM information isn't embedded, it's not relevant to scanning.
And then we get into the details in the spec of if it is embedded, this is how it's expected to be
Yes.
embedded, which is what.
That is my preference. Yonki, do you agree with this?
Yeah, I do agree. Yeah,
Okay.
I think, yeah, that's totally fine. It just, I think, yeah, for example, BOMs, we have it configurable. So we support that in both. So user can configure it. So that's no
Yeah,
problem.
build tools should absolutely be instrumented to do all kinds of interesting and useful things. You know, including output tons of additional information beyond just GitBOM. Totally on board with build tools doing that. But from the perspective of the spec and of downstream tools that are going to implement things based on the spec, I think it's important for us to say if a binary does not contain embedded GitBOM metadata, then it can be assumed not to exist.
Or maybe the reverse way to say that is something to the effect of if a binary contains embedded GitBOM data, it's expected to persist in these ways. And then you've got the ELF section, you've got the Rust crate section, you've got the.
Yeah, I'll make that as a generalization. And so ELF just becomes like one candidate for that statement. Okay, so I have clarity on this, so I can just go ahead and add this part in the spec. And so the only other item would be what should go into the ELF node section, and I'm not sure if we have enough people to close out on that today.
I know Eva's still wording that,
Yeah, that's right.
caveat for the spec, and I actually was watching her type, so I missed your last comment, Prathi. What was the last?
No, I was just mentioning that the only other open item is what should go into the node section. Is it the hash, just the hash, or the URI? There were many, I think David, Ed also had some inputs on that, and since they are not here, we will not be able to close out on that, but that's progress. We have one item that we have an agreement, and I will reword the spec to update that.
Yeah, I agree. I think last week it was like, well, he was not here, let's not talk about it. So when we have and not have everyone here, we'll talk about it.
Sure. But I have all of this implemented in LLVM GitBOM, so I can demo it next week, and we can use that as an input to decide further as well.
So the corollary, perhaps not as strictly worded, no must. What guidance would we give to implementers of the spec for how to treat a binary that does not contain an embedded artifact dependency graph identifier?
This feels like it's go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So the symlink farm is the idea to help that, at least in the build system. It will persist the artifact ID to the A to G, the graph identifier. So yeah, if we have that, I mean, we can utilize that.
Should it be may or should here? I read that should is also optional, meaning it's not mandatory. I think if it does not, there should be another way to find it, right?
Yeah. So that's an alternate.
Yeah. Do we want to? I think for this we need to support multiple optional places, right? Symlink farm is one. Our friend at Facebook was talking about another. The Microsoft Build folks are talking about yet another. So I don't think we can be as prescriptive, right? If it's not embedded in the binary, then it might be in any of these N places and formats.
Yeah, sure.
I think it'd be good to understand or to document all three that you just mentioned, Ava, and if it makes
But
sense, we
we
can
know
add-
that some will be downstream and not public, right? That's why I'm thinking the word here should be may rather than should, because we know there will be implementations, or well, we already know of people working on implementations that are not as likely to become upstreamed.
Yeah, I mean, what I thought was, if it is not there in the .node.gitbom section, there should be a way how this information is found. Otherwise, it can be any of the way, any of the alternate approaches, but you should have a way to find it. Because otherwise, you don't record any information to recreate it. That would not be desirable. Or
Yeah,
something else that will come in the future.
I agree with that, Bharati. What you should do is look. The locations may include, but you should look. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this can be, I mean, up to the tool, right? To support multiple ways, right? I think you always use some tool to do that. So.
But for that, you need to have some information recorded, right? Like if you don't record anything else in the binary itself or in the metadata, then so basically you should have an option to get that information in the absence of node section as well. I think that's the
right.
point.
I think when you generate the SBOM document, you always use some tool, right? So probably SBOM document can also support something and give some hint at least. Maybe, I mean, or if you have some prototyping, yeah, that will be more clear. But for now, I think it will up to the tool, right?
Okay, so how does that land? If an artifact does not contain embedded ADG, then then the tool, I'll fix that. Then tooling should look for that information in alternate locations. Tools may store and retrieve such information in alternate formats, such as.
Yeah.
I think this sounds good.
Yeah.
Look,
so this should this be a part of the node section spec, or does this warrant a separate bullet or an item in the spec?
Yeah, how this gets into the spec, I don't think this is part of the ELF subsection.
Yes.
I think this is probably a sort of the introduction to the file specific or format specific sections that include ELF.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, not necessary to ELF, it can be anything. Yeah, this is generic enough, right? This is for. Okay, I'll see if I can find a place to put it in, and then at the time of review, we can fix that.
I have another topic we can chat about with regards to the spec. If you want to shift.
Sure.
In the SPDX community, evolving towards the new version 3.0 of the spec, there's been a lot of discussion around identifiers that are specific to SPDX, and then being able to use other types of identifiers within the spec as well. One way that conversation is going is, well, package URL is a way that they're attempting to have a place where all identifiers can be described. And so then if SPDX or CycloneDX need to support any identifier, you don't have to change their specs as long as they support package URL. And you would change any identifiers within the package URL spec to get support there instead. Now we know, I believe we've talked about this a little bit in the past, how package URL in some ways is an identifier and in some ways is a locator. It's a little bit more messy than specifically what GitBOM is trying to accomplish. Yet there's a lot of value in aligning with it because there are many other identifier and locator formats that it can support. So the real question I have for this group is, what are your reactions to that if, say, SPDX only supported or CycloneDX only supported package URL and wasn't able to support gitoids or GitBOM?
I will bite my tongue and let others speak first. Frederick, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about what's going on the CycloneDX side, so I cannot really speak to what their plans are. I believe the SPEX group is interested in working with us, and at least previous conversations we've had, we definitely have seen that. So on the SPDX side, I'm not too concerned. In terms of CycloneDX, it would be good to eventually get some input. They're definitely aware of us. I'm not sure if they fully understood what we were doing or trying when they first on their first view of us, though. So, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
So I agree that, and have been working in the SPDX community to continue to enable that support. In fact, I think where I land on this is the identifier should support any URI or IRI. So it's interesting to see this push to say, hey, the only external identifier we'll support is pURL, and then as long as your identifier is supported in pURL, you get it for free. I see the value there. I also see that some folks may not want to use pURL to describe a gitoid or a GitBOM. And one of the things that I'm a little concerned about, and I'd like to get your opinion, is when we were discussing and getting GitBOM support in version 2.3, in fact, I think it was Ava, you and I, we were coming at this from different approaches. I was like, well, how do we just use the gitoid for the artifact? And you were saying, I thought we were talking about the gitoid for the ADG. And so we need to be able to describe both the identifier for the artifact and the identifier for the ADG. And I'm not sure how we could do that if we were to try and shim the gitoid URI format into the pURL URI format.
Blob and bomb.
Blob and bomb, okay.
I believe was the thing we had proposed back then.
Okay.
Right. The gitoid URI format has a header, has 3 header fields followed by the hash field. And one of those header fields is blob or bomb.
Got it. So that could at least support that part. That's good. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
Other thoughts on this?
Now that I've said that, let me go double check that isn't just in my head.
Yeah, so in the IANA filing, it is current valid values for Git object
Blob,
type
tree,
row.
commit, and tag, because that's what Git supports. Bomb is not one of them. Yep.
Right. So this is something that our spec supports, but
the gitoid URI does not.
right.
Yep.
And it could, if we submitted changes to this provisional application, and we get into these details as we've been improving the spec for the last few months. And
by the way, in the pURL, if I recall properly, there's a qualifiers section. So there might be information that could be injected into such an area that could include the gitoid. And I mean, I don't know if it makes fully sense to do that or not, but that might be something to look into as well.
Yeah, I seem to recall that when I had asked about that, the recommendation was you could use qualifiers if you needed to, but not to by default. I'll have to go back and look at that. I think it is an option.
Yeah, because qualifiers were for, like, I might have a package and then I may build that package for Red Hat, and then I may build a second one for Debian. They're both the same version, the same software, packaged differently. And the qualifier was designed specifically to allow you to scope it to a specific one. But it also looks like it's free format enough that you could throw in some information about the about GitBOM as well, and say, because it's ultimately a scoping down. So we could say this particular package has or piece of software has this specific GitBOM or gitoid, or which could be either the identifier of the object itself or the ADG, and then that information would effectively be saying that this pURL only applies to this specific one. In the same way that you say this specific pURL only applies to exactly the Red Hat one that we built, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. That is one option. So what I just found, I pasted in the chat, is like the spec for package URL. So the scheme ends up being PKG. It always is, right? And so then what we're trying to do here is figure out what goes to the type versus the namespace or name, and do we use any of those qualifiers?
Yeah, I will say that I would prefer something that was better than just a qualifier, or something more detailed than just a qualifier. But there is a possibility there. Rather, there is an escape hatch.
Yeah, that's probably the way to put it. So I mean, you could definitely do package gitoid, and then I mean, we could use type instead of namespace if we support blob and BOM, and then we're good, because the name is the gitoid, right? And we now know it's a gitoid for the ADG or a gitoid for the artifact. Anyway, things to think about. I guess the first part of this is really, do we have clear ways that others can distinguish between the ADG and the artifact? And I think that does need what you highlight there, Ava, in the notes.
Yeah, so I missed some of your conversation about the pURL syntax while I was looking this up. I think our BOM file format conforms to the Git tree file format. That's certainly what Ed and I drew inspiration from as we defined our BOM file format. So we might not need to change the spec. It might be blob or tree. Right, which does unfortunately lead to potential confusion for someone consuming a pURL. Is it referring to a GitBOM tree or a Git tree? Right.
Yeah.
Do any of the specs support multiple pURLs as well? Like, do we say this pURL matches for a Red Hat package and also this GitBOM?
Can a single SPDX document version 3.0 have multiple pURLs embedded?
Yes. And that's where there will be additional value, is being able to link that gitoid back to this and this, this version of Red Hat or this version of Debian or whatever.
Well, at the top level of an SPDX document, or embedding in subsections, having different pURLs, right? I think, if I'm remembering my 3.0 format draft that I reviewed like 3-4 months back. Yes, you can have multiple URLs in there, but each one needs to be part of a unique identifier. You can't have the same field type at the same level of the document multiple times.
So what we have in version 3 on the element itself, the element which describes the package, we have external identifiers, and you can have 0 or more external identifiers attached to that.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So here's the latest version that y'all
0 or more. So you could have 100 external identifiers for a single package.
You could.
Interesting.
And I mean, because the way the package URL works, you likely want to have more than one, because it could be confusing with only one, either where to locate it or what its identifier is. So that's one of the advantages of getting GitBOM support within package URL.
Yeah.
I have a question, just a general one. By looking at the artifact ID or the gitoid, are we also expected to understand the type of hash? Because right now it's an identifier, but you don't know whether it is what is the, how it's computed, or what is the hash type, etc. Just like we qualified the blob bomb to indicate it's because artifact ID and a gitoid is going to look alike, and only by adding that qualifier, you know whether it is referring to the bomb document or just the artifact itself. So similarly, is there a need to understand the hash as well, or the scheme that went into computing that by looking at it, or is it's just an identifier and that's how it has to
So
be viewed?
the hash is part of the gitoid.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe let's switch back to the pURL syntax and explode out those 7 elements of that schema.
Okay.
And I'll do the note taking for that explosion, so we can see
Let
exactly
me
what.
do that on your behalf.
Oh,
So
wonderful! Thank
I
you.
started by doing a little fishing to understand, but I actually was asking this and going back and forth with them. So take a look at this PR, and there's a couple of different proposals that I made, and there's 1 or 2 that they're landing on. And I just wanted to bring it back to everyone here before applying.
Okay, so literal word package, literal word gitoid, git object type, hash value. So, but I think that answers your question right there.
Okay, I missed seeing this.
But that was my proposal, and then we went back and forth around, and Steve says, well, that's going to violate the spec. So we go back and forth a couple different times before we ever land on things that could work. The point is that we've exploded in a couple different iterations. Down below, I give you different options that might work here, but I think I haven't found a clean way to map the gitoid URI to the pURL URI.
So here I think is the crux of my objection back in roughly March, April. Steve says, how do I locate a gitoid? That his objection there implies that a pURL must be a locator and it may be an identifier. And that's the crux of my objection to pURLs in SPDX. We need an identifier. We may have a locator, so it's backwards. pURLs are perfectly backwards.
I understand, yet I also have seen many technologies that win because not because they're the most precise, but because they have the biggest market share. And so
absolutely.
I'm looking for flexibility here so that we can support and get value out of both mechanisms.
Yep. Locators are great when you need to distribute things. Identifiers are great when you need to know what it is you've just got.
So my 1, 2, 3 that you scrolled through are 3 different ways that I tried to explode that out. And I even give you examples of what I'm trying to accomplish with each of them.
Yeah, I think this is roughly what I expect right here. Identifier, not locator. Oh, and pURL doesn't allow colon. That's exciting.
Right.
I mean, you could, percent
so
it.
The only way I found to do this cleanly was to use gitoid instead of PKG, but it seems like as part of that package URL spec, package the scheme isn't flexible. It's always going to be scheme equals PKG.
That's bizarre. Again, he comes back to locate. I don't think they're, this is a flippant answer, but I don't think they're compatible if a pURL must be a locator and may be an identifier. A gitoid must be an identifier and may not be, not even maybe, it must not be a locator.
I get you.
Yeah. The only way to make them compatible would be to use a global file system, right? AUFS or, you know, any of the global file systems could be chosen to create a locator for a unique object.
Just a little nit. I'm sure you're familiar with this. The content addressable storage is I think the most appropriate one for that.
Yep.
And because I believe there are some global file systems out there that don't hold that could not hold that property, but although most of them, most practical ones do, because that lets you bring in distributive hash tables into the mix and make it easy.
A very well taken clarification. Thanks, Roderick.
But I think the point is excellent here, that it must not be a locator. Like if a locator could use a GitBOM if it chose to do so, but that certainly is not the point of GitBOM.
So part of this comes back to Bharathi's question of, hey, how do we distinguish the hash algorithm used, SHA-1 or SHA-256? And so here's one proposal for how we could embed that. The other we've discussed, it doesn't provide semantic meaning, but you could derive the hash type based on the length of the hash value.
You can't, though. We covered that in a couple previous back calls. There are some hash functions that have the same output length.
Not some that are supported by GitBOM today. So it puts a dependency on the future support of other hash functions. I completely agree.
Right.
It wouldn't be extensible if we allow that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Wilbar's comment here actually is an example of the one that I verbalized a minute ago. Use the % format for the colon. I have no concern with that.
Okay. Other thoughts? That's a perfectly. That may be the best way to go here.
I also agree with that, because I had the same thought when I was implementing the node section, whether it was a need to specify, and I think Frederick or someone else clarified that, yeah, there could be multiple hash algorithms that generate the same length of hash, even though currently we only support SHA-1 and SHA-256, but yeah, it wouldn't be for a spec, it wouldn't be generalized.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it to where we're creating brittleness in this spec. So I'm just saying that we're on the same page.
Yeah, SHA-2 is a really good example, because there are 6 algorithms that produce a total of 4 possible lengths, and then SHA-3 makes it even worse by having the same 6 for 4, but then adds 2 more that are a variable length hash outputs. So you can't even tell what it is at that point. Not that we have a problem in the initial one, but we don't know what's going to come down the line. Like 10 years from now, is SHA-2 going to be broken in some fundamental way?
Right. So
I think that, and I was good with William's suggestion there, but wanted to bring you all up to speed on the conversation that happened through this conversation. I thank you all for your thoughts and feedback, I'll reply to that. The crux of this is still that we'll need to be able to represent the ADG via a BOM type. And I think the way to start with that is that we are more explicit about it in our spec, and we propose it in the pURL spec, and then we work with Ed to get it into the update of the GitBOM URI filing to IANA over time. Does that sound reasonable?
What were those two? One is blob versus bomb. The other one
Right.
was,
So I was going down on that one specifically. Let's see, the other one was the hash type, different hash types support. So we have to semantically convey the hash algorithm.
great.
And so the
Okay.
next steps, I guess, is what I was going towards is I'll reply if you all want to confirm with a reply as well, just an agreement that helps support the position of this community. And then we need, which is flagged in yellow, Ed to follow up on the IANA filing. And we need to make sure that we are explicitly, I think we've already done this in the spec, but we need to make sure that our spec is clearly communicating that BOM represents the ADG versus blob, which represents the artifact.
I still don't see any way to resolve this problem.
I have gone back and forth on it and have heard arguments from William that it can be an identifier. It is an identifier. It doesn't have to be a locator. So I think even within the package URL community, you have differences of opinion, and
Okay,
that's something that they need to work out. I don't know that we need to solve that for them. I think my question is more importantly, how can we enable support for GitBOM within that spec so that we gain the value of the traction that it is gaining across the SBOM communities?
gotcha. Yeah, if that is not in fact the consensus of the pURL community, and we can use pURLs as an identifier and not a locator, then I don't see any problem with GitBOM being included. Great. Cool. Thanks, Jeff.
Is this worded the right way? Do we mean it the other way? Can pURLs be used as an identifier and not as a locator?
Thank you. Yep, this is what happens when I take notes and try and talk at the same time.
Not a problem. I was scratching my head there, thinking, hold on a second.
Okay. Cool. Well, we got a great conversation today.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate that.
So if they take in GitBOM, our next move should be to ask them to rename it from pURL to pURI.
It's not a locator, it's an identifier.
Exactly.
You
And
might
also
also ask
putty.
them to remove package from their name. But they say the generic package.
So URI then, okay.
exactly.
Yeah, or we'll come up with a different name for L rather than computer. I'm sure we can find one.
It's actually the exact feedback that has been provided on more than one occasion within the SPDX